The courtroom was suffocatingly silent when the judge's gavel struck, echoing like thunder against old wooden walls, and every face turned pale. Sarah Miller said, "This can't be the end. Someone is hiding the truth." Her voice trembled but carried sharp defiance. Michael Reed, seated at the back, clenched his fists, his jaw tight, knowing more than he had ever dared to reveal. The moment felt heavier than the decades of whispers that had preceded it. In that instant, the disappearance no one ever solved became a roaring wound again. Rebecca Hayes said, "It's done, justice has spoken," but the hollow in her tone betrayed doubt, her comforting facade slipping. James Carter watched from the corner, the weight of loyalty and betrayal grinding inside him. Across the aisle, Edward Graves leaned forward, his eyes calculating, his control intact, his silence a weapon. The memory of Anna Wilson, forever 16, filled the space like smoke, her presence unshakable. The gavel's echo became more than a verdict. It was the awakening of buried sins. Nothing would remain hidden now, because justice had not been delivered, only postponed. The rain outside turned heavier as Sarah walked quickly through the courthouse steps, her heels striking like echoes of unfinished battles. She whispered, "Every year it comes back, and every year they silence me." Michael followed behind, silent but close, his eyes carrying the burden of truths unspoken. Rebecca appeared near the doorway, her voice gentle. "Sarah, you must rest. Not every fight can be won tonight." But Sarah shook her head sharply, unwilling to surrender to false comfort. James, lingering near the shadows, muttered, "Rest isn't what she seeks, answers are." His tone was low but sharp. Edward's black car pulled to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the storm, his presence looming though he said nothing. And somewhere, through the blur of rain, the memory of Anna's laughter echoed, faint but piercing. The storm outside was not just weather, it was history pressing against the present. Every face knew it, though not all would admit it. Sarah's apartment was dim, filled with the soft hum of a forgotten coffee machine she never finished. She said, "I keep the letter, but I can't open it." Her fingers brushed the sealed envelope on the counter. Michael leaned against the wall, staring at her, silent but restless. Rebecca, sitting gently on the couch, said, "Holding it back only feeds the wound." But Sarah turned away, staring at the rain-beaten window, unable to face her. James entered quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee, muttering, "She never drinks it." His words carried the weight of years of repetition. Edward's voice rang from Sarah's voicemail machine, smooth and chilling. "The past is better left sealed." The room chilled at his control. Anna's humming echoed faintly in Sarah's mind, the sound of memory refusing to fade. The whispers began again in the town, fragments of Anna's name spilling across bars, libraries, and alleys. Sarah said, "They never stop speaking of her, but no one dares search." Rebecca replied, "Whispers are safer than truths." Michael slammed the table. "Safe doesn't bring her back." James shook his head, voice steady. "Whispers are warnings, not just fears." Edward walked in with a calm smile, his voice low. "Whispers only matter when someone listens." And for a moment, Anna's image flickered on the jukebox screen like a ghost, uninvited yet unforgotten. Sarah stood at the old train station, the place she returned to every year, her hands pressed to the weathered bench where Anna once sat. She whispered, "You never left me, not really." The wind howled through broken glass panes, carrying faint echoes of Anna's humming. Michael stood nearby, restless, muttering, "One day you'll have to face it." Rebecca placed her hand lightly on Sarah's shoulder, but Sarah pulled away. James' voice came from behind, "Every bench keeps its memory." Edward's figure appeared at the far end, still, watchful, a shadow against the rain. And Anna, in Sarah's heart, was not gone but waiting. Morning crept in through thin curtains, turning Sarah's apartment into a faded photograph. Sarah Miller said, "I keep circling the same point, like the truth is a drain." The sealed letter lay on the table, a quiet dare she would not meet. Rebecca Hayes said, "You do not have to open it today, but choose why you will not." Michael Reed paced the small kitchen, restless energy scraping the air. Michael Reed said, "Someone wanted this case to die, and we helped by waiting." James Carter hovered near the door, steady but watchful like a guard. James Carter said, "We move with care, not fear." Sarah touched the paper seam, then pulled back as if burned. Sarah Miller said, "If I read it, there is no going back." The room held its breath with her. A distant siren wailed, thin as a thread pulled from the past. Sarah Miller said, "I will not be steered by threats again." The day, at last, began to feel like a decision. The diner smelled of coffee and rain on asphalt, a place where hard talk sounded softer. Rebecca Hayes said, "You are not alone, Sarah, and your pain does not owe anyone answers." Her hand grazed Sarah's sleeve, gentle as a promise and sharp as a hook. Sarah Miller said, "Kindness is a net too, when I cannot see its knots." Michael Reed watched their reflection in the chrome, eyes dark with warning. Michael Reed said, "Help can be leverage when the bill comes due." Rebecca's smile did not slip, but the corners carried math. Rebecca Hayes said, "I remember what you need, and I ask little in return." The waitress set mugs that steamed like fresh doubt. Sarah Miller said, "I will pay the price if it buys the truth." Outside, a black sedan idled, quiet as a whisper waiting to be heard. The storm had passed, yet the glass still shook with trains far off. James Carter said, "We stay together, or the story eats us in pieces." The alley behind the Arts Center held wet chalk and city breath, and a new voice cut the fog. Riley Quinn said, "Your map is wrong, the tracks go under the old canning yard." She stepped from shadow with a sketchbook full of angles and names. Sarah Miller said, "Who are you to know that?" Riley Quinn said, "Someone who listens to walls and keeps what others throw away." Michael Reed moved closer, measuring this sudden spark. Michael Reed said, "You were watching us." Riley Quinn said, "Watching the lies, actually." She flipped to a page marked with Anna's initials and a date. Riley Quinn said, "There is a grate with a rusted chain, and it was cut, not broken." Sarah's breath faltered, as if memory had teeth. Sarah Miller said, "Show me, and do not vanish." The city blinked, and the case inhaled. The records office smelled like dust and ink, a vault of paper lungs. James Carter said, "We verify the grate and the chain, and we do it clean." He spread blueprints across a green felt table. Sarah Miller said, "If the chain was cut, someone returned after the search was closed." Michael Reed traced faded lines, hunting for a path beneath the rails. Michael Reed said, "There's a service tunnel that never made the reports." Rebecca Hayes stood near the lamp, face serene, eyes calculating roots of comfort. Rebecca Hayes said, "If we find proof, we must protect it from those who bend truth." The lamp buzzed, a small sun over fragile history. James Carter said, "I will handle the access request." His tone promised order and hinted at gates. Sarah Miller said, "No more delays that look like care." The blueprints rustled like birds taking off. The past reshaped the map and pointed down. They reached the canning yard at dusk, where rails slept under weeds and secrets. Riley Quinn said, "Here." She knelt by a storm grate scarred with orange rust. Sarah Miller said, "Do not touch the cut." Michael Reed lifted a flashlight, and the beam found clean metal where teeth had bitten. Michael Reed said, "This is not age, this is intent." James Carter checked the perimeter with a steady sweep of light. James Carter said, "We document, then we move." Rebecca Hayes stood close to Sarah, voice low enough to pass for care. Rebecca Hayes said, "The truth wants a witness, not a hero." A distant hum rose, like a song half remembered. Sarah Miller said, "Anna, we are here." The grate breathed up cool air from a room that should not exist. The night agreed to open. The investigation reopened under the buzz of fluorescent lights in the precinct basement, the air thick with paper and ink. Sarah Miller said, "These files are bones, stripped but not buried." Michael Reed sifted through old photos, his hands rough but deliberate. Michael Reed said, Someone erased parts of this, and they left fingerprints in the silence. James Carter leaned against the metal shelf, steady voice anchoring them. James Carter said, "We find the gap. We find who feared the truth." Rebecca Hayes sat apart, watching, her warmth dimmed into caution. Rebecca Hayes said, "Be careful what you uncover, sometimes light burns." Riley Quinn sketched quickly in her notebook, her eyes flickering with restless certainty. Riley Quinn said, "The great leads here, but something else does too." The hum of the building wrapped them, a cage of whispers. Sarah Miller said, "If they tried to bury Anna, they failed, because she's louder now than ever." The group gathered in Sarah's apartment, rain pelting against the window, tension sharper than knives. Michael Reed said, "The photographs were altered, the dates are wrong." His words landed like strikes. Sarah Miller said, "They did not just lose her, they erased her." Rebecca Hayes clasped her hands, her tone soft but unsettling. Rebecca Hayes said, "Erasure is still a kind of memory, dangerous and chosen." Riley Quinn lifted a sketch showing the grate connected to old rail tunnels. Riley Quinn said, "This map doesn't match the city's archive." James Carter studied it, steady but conflicted. James Carter said, "I know someone who signed these off, and I cannot say why." Sarah's chest tightened, betrayal close enough to taste. Sarah Miller said, "Then it starts inside, not outside." The storm rattled the glass harder, like the past demanding to be heard. The alley smelled of iron and damp, as Riley Quinn crouched near discarded items piled against a wall. Riley Quinn said, "People hide things where trash lives." She pulled out a torn badge, rusted but legible. Sarah Miller's breath caught, her voice low. Sarah Miller said, "That belongs to the officer who closed the file." Michael Reed stepped forward, anger under his skin. Michael Reed said, "He was here, not just on paper." James Carter stared, the tension of silence heavy in him. James Carter said, "This changes who we trust." Rebecca Hayes touched Sarah's arm gently, her voice careful. Rebecca Hayes said, "Then tread lightly, because the ground is thin." Riley placed the badge into Sarah's hand, her sharp eyes steady. Riley Quinn said, "Truth doesn't stay clean. It drags mud." The city around them hummed with secrets, waiting. Rebecca's kitchen was warm, yet her words curled cold in the air. Rebecca Hayes said, "I know what it means to keep a truth under velvet cloth." She poured tea, eyes locked on Sarah. Sarah Miller said, "Comfort cannot cover betrayal." Rebecca smiled softly, but her silence stretched. Riley Quinn muttered, "You talk like you are not part of this, but you are." Michael Reed crossed his arms, sharp glare unrelenting. Michael Reed said, "She knew details no one else did." James Carter placed his cup down slowly, tone low. James Carter said, "We cannot afford suspicion inside the circle." Rebecca's expression remained calm, a mask hiding fire. Rebecca Hayes said, "Suspicion feeds division, truth feeds fire." Sarah's voice broke through like steel. Sarah Miller said, "Then show which one you are." The kitchen clock ticked louder, marking each fragile second. Edward Graves entered the gallery like silence wearing a suit, his polished shoes echoing. Edward Graves said, "You dig, but the soil belongs to me." Sarah Miller's voice cut through, raw. Sarah Miller said, "Anna was not yours to erase." His smile was precise, controlled. Michael Reed's fists clenched, barely held in place. Michael Reed said, "Tell us why the badge was at the yard." Edward's eyes lingered, cold and still. Edward Graves said, "The badge was where I left it, to see who would find it." Riley Quinn flared, her voice sharp. Riley Quinn said, "You use people like mirrors." Rebecca Hayes looked down, her calm cracking. James Carter said, "If this is a game, it ends with names." Edward leaned back, untouchable in posture. Edward Graves said, "Games end when I decide." The room's silence felt like a trap snapping shut. The witness room was suffocating with its low ceiling and yellowed paint, the clock ticking louder than hearts. Sarah Miller said, "Tell me what you saw that night." The man's hands trembled as he slid forward an old notebook, its pages cracked with age. He whispered, "She was not taken, she chose to leave." Michael Reed leaned forward, voice sharp. "You expect us to believe Anna walked away?" The man shook his head, sweat on his brow. "Not alone. Someone waited for her." Sarah's chest felt crushed under the words, the memory twisting anew. Rebecca Hayes murmured, "Sometimes running is survival, not betrayal." Riley Quinn snapped, "That's an excuse, not truth." James Carter spoke low, "We must know who helped her." The room felt smaller, the air tightening around them. The notebook was a key, and its ink burned like fire in Sarah's sight. The revelation struck like lightning when Sarah found James' signature on the old access forms. Sarah Miller said, "This is your handwriting." James Carter froze, the weight in his silence louder than thunder. James Carter said, "It was for the greater good, or so I believe." Michael Reed's voice erupted, "You covered their tracks." Rebecca Hayes said softly, "Loyalty wears many faces, some cut deeper." Riley Quinn's eyes narrowed, her voice trembling with rage, "You betrayed her before you betrayed us." James clenched his fists, torn between shame and defense. James Carter said, "I thought protecting the city meant sacrificing one truth." Sarah's eyes filled with fury. Sarah Miller said, "Sacrifice is not yours to decide." The room spiraled with betrayal, every word breaking another bond. The air was heavy with fractures that could not be mended. The warehouse near the tracks carried echoes of freight and secrets. Sarah Miller said, "This is where they led her." She pointed at scuffed concrete that bore faint chains. Michael Reed whispered, "This is not just a hiding place, it was a passage." James Carter stood apart, guilt weighing him down like stone. James Carter said, "I never knew what they used it for." Riley Quinn crouched, eyes sharp, tracing chalk lines faded on the floor. Riley Quinn said, "She was here, I can feel it." Rebecca Hayes' voice broke the silence. "If she left by choice, she left through this door." Edward Graves stepped from the shadows, his voice calm. Edward Graves said, "And I made sure the door stayed closed." The sound of trains roared overhead, drowning their hearts in thunder. The storm outside cracked as Riley unfolded her sketch, revealing Anna's initials carved beside her own in the canning yard. Riley Quinn said, "She left me a sign, I was the one meant to find it." Sarah Miller gasped, her eyes burning. Sarah Miller said, "You were connected all along." Michael Reed said, "Why did you never speak of this?" Riley's voice shook, but her stare was unyielding. Riley Quinn said, "No one believed a child who sketched walls." Rebecca Hayes placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, her voice measured. Rebecca Hayes said, "Sometimes the truth waits for its chosen witness." James Carter muttered, "Every silence has a cost." Sarah's voice cracked but carried steel. Sarah Miller said, "Anna tied her fate to you, and now ours follows." Lightning split the sky, marking the bond between past and present. Edward Graves' office gleamed with perfection, spotless glass and controlled air. Edward Graves said, "The truth is mine to write." Sarah Miller's voice lashed back. Sarah Miller said, "You are the reason justice rotted." He smiled, measured, never breaking eye contact. Michael Reed struck the desk with his fist. Michael Reed said, "Tell us what you did to Anna." Edward's gaze held, his tone quiet but sharp. Edward Graves said, "She asked me to keep her gone, and I did." Silence drowned the room, a revelation like a blade. Riley Quinn whispered, "She trusted the wrong savior." Rebecca Hayes' eyes narrowed, her calm mask finally cracking. Rebecca Hayes said, "Control is fragile when built on stolen truth." James Carter's voice was heavy, "We end this now." The office light flickered, as if even electricity recoiled. The trial chamber was suffocating with the weight of voices and the glare of lights. Sarah Miller said, This is not justice, this is a performance. Her words carried like fire across the marble floor. Edward Graves stood, unflinching, his voice calm as steel. Edward Graves said, "You seek truth, yet truth is crafted by power." Michael Reed slammed his fist against the rail, his voice sharp. Michael Reed said, "Power will not erase her name." Rebecca Hayes whispered near Sarah's ear, "Be careful, anger feeds his control." Riley Quinn rose from her seat, sketchbook in hand, trembling but loud. Riley Quinn said, "She trusted me to finish what was stolen." James Carter stood slowly, voice heavy with betrayal and regret. James Carter said, "I will not defend silence any longer." The judge's gavel cracked, but its echo was drowned in shouts. The chamber turned into a battlefield without swords. Behind closed doors, Sarah and Edward faced each other, no jury to shield the silence. Edward Graves said, "You think she wanted saving, but she wanted freedom from all of you." Sarah Miller shook, rage and grief colliding. Sarah Miller said, "Freedom does not mean vanishing into chains." Edward's smirk was precise, his tone deliberate. Edward Graves said, "She chose me because I keep secrets." Michael Reed stepped forward, voice low and trembling. Michael Reed said, "No, you buried her to own her." Riley Quinn's voice broke, raw with hurt. Riley Quinn said, "You twisted her trust into a weapon." Rebecca Hayes touched her chest, eyes darkening. Rebecca Hayes said, "If truth dies here, then so does every chance of healing." James Carter pressed his palm against the table. James Carter said, "This is the last moment we bow to silence." The room shook with its own stillness. Sarah stood alone in the courthouse hallway, her reflection fractured in the glass. Sarah Miller said, "I survived, but surviving is not living." Her hands shook as she held the sealed envelope closer to her heart. Michael Reed joined her, his voice rough but steady. Michael Reed said, "You cannot carry all of it, Sarah." She shook her head, eyes glistening. Sarah Miller said, "I was the one left, the one who never stopped hearing her voice." Rebecca Hayes approached gently, soft words carrying a hidden blade. Rebecca Hayes said, "Guilt is a leash if you let it." Riley Quinn pressed against the wall, sketching Anna's face in silence, her voice breaking. Riley Quinn said, "She is more alive here than they know." James Carter appeared last, voice low, "You are not alone in the ruin." The hallway echoed with truths none could silence. The chamber filled with chaos as Riley Quinn shouted, "Enough hiding!" She slammed her sketchbook on the bench, pages filled with Anna's initials and maps. Sarah Miller's breath hitched, her eyes flashing. Sarah Miller said, "This is the truth they feared." Edward Graves leaned forward, his mask beginning to break. Edward Graves said, "You cannot prove what she never denied." Michael Reed's voice cut through. Michael Reed said, "Denial is not proof, it's your weapon." Rebecca Hayes said softly, "Sometimes power falls on its own weight." James Carter's tone hardened. James Carter said, "This is where the fire starts." Sarah Miller lifted the sketchbook, her voice unwavering. Sarah Miller said, "Anna lives in every silence you tried to control." The chamber roared with voices, no longer contained. Edward Graves finally faltered, his calm shattered under weight he could not bend. Edward Graves said, "She chose me because none of you could protect her." Sarah Miller's voice rose like thunder. Sarah Miller said, "You caged her and called it choice." Michael Reed's hands shook as he leaned forward. Michael Reed said, "You were her jailer, not her savior." Rebecca Hayes whispered, "Avery mask breaks." Riley Quinn cried out, "She trusted me, not you." James Carter, voice steady, said, "Your power dies here, with your words." The gavel slammed again, but this time it was not an echo of silence. It was a fracture. The chamber's air shifted, history rewritten in the sound of defiance. For the first time, Edward's silence was not control but defeat. The courtroom emptied, leaving Sarah clutching the sealed envelope with trembling hands. Sarah Miller said, Justice is close, but it feels like ash. Michael Reed stood beside her, voice low but steady. Michael Reed said, "We proved the lie, but the cost carved us open." Rebecca Hayes lingered near the door, her warmth cracked into weariness. Rebecca Hayes said, "Truth does not heal, it scars deeper." Riley Quinn sketched Anna's face one last time, eyes wet with grief. Riley Quinn said, "At least she is no longer erased." James Carter leaned against the wall, his guilt pressing heavy. James Carter said, "I will carry my part forever." Sarah closed her eyes, her breath sharp. Sarah Miller said, "Carrying is not the same as living." The hall felt larger than it was, as if it stretched into endless silence. Rebecca's mask finally cracked as she stood before Sarah, her voice low and trembling. Rebecca Hayes said, "I wanted to shield you, but my care was another chain." Sarah's eyes sharpened, her voice raw. Sarah Miller said, "You betrayed me under kindness." Rebecca's tears streaked her calm facade, hands shaking. Rebecca Hayes said, "Every comfort I gave was also a bargain." Michael Reed clenched his fists, fury clear. Michael Reed said, "You chose control over truth." Riley Quinn's voice pierced, sharp. Riley Quinn said, "Anna trusted too easily, just like we trusted you." James Carter spoke softly, "Sometimes loyalty is the cruelest mask." Rebecca dropped her gaze, whispering. Rebecca Hayes said, "I never stopped caring, even when I lied." The silence between them was heavy with shattered bonds. James Carter stood before the group, his voice carrying the weight of broken loyalty. James Carter said, "I signed away a piece of truth, thinking it would protect the city." Sarah Miller said, "You sacrificed her for your illusion." His shoulders sagged, guilt etched deep. James Carter said, "I thought I was steady, but I was the hand that held the door closed." Michael Reed stepped forward, voice bitter. Michael Reed said, "You chose power over her." Riley Quinn's voice cracked, fierce and pained. Riley Quinn said, "She could have lived if you had spoken." Rebecca Hayes whispered, "His silence was a wound, and wounds spread." James' voice trembled. James Carter said, "I will bear it even if it breaks me." The room darkened with truths finally confessed. They gathered at the canning yard one last time, rain falling heavy. Sarah Miller touched the grate where Anna's initials had been carved. Sarah Miller said, her voice was never gone, only hidden. Riley Quinn placed her hand beside Sarah's, whispering. Riley Quinn said, "She left it for me, for us to carry forward." Michael Reed shone his flashlight into the darkness, his tone sharp. Michael Reed said, "This was a passage, not an end." Rebecca Hayes stood still, voice subdued. Rebecca Hayes said, "Every sign she left was her way of refusing silence." James Carter lowered his head, words quiet. James Carter said, "This is where my betrayal lives." Sarah's voice rose steady. Sarah Miller said, "This is where truth breathes, even if it kills us." The storm swallowed their words, carrying them into the night. The verdict outside never mattered as much as the silence they carried within. Sarah Miller said, "Justice is a word bent by too many hands." She lifted the envelope, pressing it against her chest but not opening it. Michael Reed said, "Justice is what we demand, not what they grant." Rebecca Hayes whispered, "Justice is twisted, but truth remains." Riley Quinn's eyes shone with defiance. Riley Quinn said, "We remember her louder than they buried her." James Carter's voice was steady but broken. James Carter said, "I will never undo what I signed, but I will never hide again." The storm broke into a fragile calm, the air cleansed but heavy. Sarah's final whisper trembled. Sarah Miller said, "Justice is not served, but it is no longer silent." The night closed around them, leaving only memory and fire. The courthouse was silent now, its walls echoing only with the storm that had passed. Sarah Miller said, "The noise is gone, but the weight stays." Michael Reed stood near her, voice low. Michael Reed said, "We gave them truth, even if they rejected it. Rebecca Hayes lingered behind, her soft voice faltering. Rebecca Hayes said, "Truth does not free us. It binds us differently." Riley Quinn clutched her sketchbook close, whispering, "At least her name will never vanish." James Carter lowered his head, heavy with regret. James Carter said, "Some debts will follow until my last breath." The emptiness of the hall felt heavier than the trial itself. Sarah walked alone down the rain-washed street, the lamplight flickering above her. Sarah Miller said, "Every year I come back to the place that holds her." Michael Reed followed at a distance, his silence protective. Rebecca Hayes stopped at the corner, her calm presence fading into shadow. Riley Quinn trailed with her sketchbook open, sketching Anna's initials again. James Carter leaned against a post, his eyes distant, carrying his shame. The night hummed with unfinished truths. Sarah whispered, "This road has always led back to her." At the old train station, Sarah knelt before the weathered bench, her hand pressed to its wood. Sarah Miller said, "This is where I still hear you." The wind whistled through broken glass panes, echoing faint humming. Michael Reed stood nearby, his voice heavy. Michael Reed said, "You cannot carry her forever." Riley Quinn whispered sharply, "She is still here. She left signs only I could see." Rebecca Hayes touched the railing, her words soft. Rebecca Hayes said, "Memory is cruel. It never fades kindly." James Carter's voice was quiet. "Every truth I buried led us here." The station felt alive with Anna's ghost. Sarah held the envelope at last, her fingers trembling as though it pulsed with Anna's voice. Sarah Miller said, "If I open this, it ends, or it begins again." Michael Reed urged softly, "It does not have to control you." Rebecca Hayes whispered, "Truth is choice, not command." Riley Quinn cried, "She left it for you, not them." James Carter said, "No matter what is inside, it cannot change who remembers her." Sarah pressed it against her lips, but did not tear the seal. Sarah Miller said, "She stays alive this way." The letter remained closed, her silence louder than any word. The night closed with Sarah's whisper echoing into silence. Sarah Miller said, "Justice was never solved, but she is not forgotten." The others stood behind her, shadows bound by memory. Michael Reed said, "Her name will outlive the lies." Rebecca Hayes said, "Her silence is not defeat, it is reminder." Riley Quinn said, "She drew paths we still follow." James Carter said, "Her truth lives in us, not in verdicts." The last sound was the wind carrying Anna's faint humming, timeless and unresolved. The unanswered question lingered. Was she taken, or did she choose to disappear?